In the previous lesson, we created a new database, a SQL Server local DB database for development purposes only, and we added it to our project. Then we used tools that were added to Visual Studio, specifically the SQL Server data tools, in order to view the database, to add tables, to add data to the tables, and so on. And so now what we want to do is use an API within the .NET Framework class library called the Entity Framework to actually access that data or manipulate that data using C# code. So the Entity Framework is a subset of the entire ADO.NET API. It is the newer aspect of that larger ADO.NET API. It has a lot of the momentum, but it's certainly not the only way to access data in a SQL Server database. Again, the Data Persistence Fundamental Series will explain your options and why you might choose one or the other. The great thing about the Entity Framework is that it serves as what's called an object relational mapper, and essentially, in layman's terms, it makes working with the database feel like you're working with any other sort of classes and objects in your application. And we're already familiar with working with classes and objects, so working with the database now will be simple for the most part. Again, as long as we stay on the rails and only use this one technique for working with data. We'll learn more in, again, the Data Persistence Fundamental Series. So, as you'll see, the Entity Framework takes care of things like connecting to the database, querying the database on our behalf, disconnecting whenever we're finished working with the database, and so on. And it does this by generating a lot of code in our project, as we'll see here in just a moment. It'll generate the code using wizards that will fill out. It'll step us through the process of connecting to the database and choosing what objects from that database, what tables that we want to work with, and so on. And then we'll also see that it creates a series of templates that will automatically generate code for us. These templates, as we'll see in a moment, have the extension .tt, and that stands for T4 Templates, technology that was baked into Visual Studio a number of years ago. But at the end of all of this, what we'll have is something called an entity data model. And that entity data model will essentially give us entities that represent the data underneath the hood. It's a data model that will work against and will allow that abstraction layer from the Entity Framework to deal with all of the messy details of actually inserting data, updating data, reading data, deleting data, and so forth. Okay, so to get started, what we're going to do is make sure, first of all, that we're starting in the same spot. So make sure you download the code for this lesson. If you take a look here, I've got a before and after folder. If you're not picking this up from the previous lesson, then you'll want to copy the before folder into your projects folder and open it up and work along with me. However, if you have followed along faithfully from the previous lesson, you won't need to take this step. I will also be posting, as I always do, the code that I finish with in the after folder. So just keep that in mind. So I already have the current state of the local DB example project opened up, and what I want to do is select the project node in the Solution Explorer and select Project, Add New Item menu option, and we'll see the Add New Item dialog. We'll want to make sure to choose the right template, Visual C# Web, or actually Visual C# Data instead, and we'll select the very first option, at least the option here, in mind. And so we're going to create an entity data model, and I'm going to call this Acme, because again that's the name of our fictitious company, Acme Entities. Alright, and you'll see how that term is used here in just a little bit. And I'll go ahead and click the Add button. Here we have the entity data model wizard that again will set up the connections and will start generating code for us to make a connection to the database. So we have several different options. The Entity Framework is very flexible in how you choose to use it inside of your application. We want to make sure to select the EF Designer from Database options. As we started with the database, we want to use the database to create our database model. There are other options where we could start with code first and let the code generate the database instead, and that's called code first workflow. And then we can also choose kind of a hybrid solution where we're still creating a model of the data from the database originally, but it'll create the code that from this point on now we can manipulate using C# classes to manipulate the layout of the database. Again, talk about that at length in other courses here in the curriculum. So let's continue on here, having selected the EF Designer from the database. Since we're connected in the Server Explorer to the acme.mdf, the local DB called Acme here in our app data folder, it will go ahead and select that database as the connection for the connection that we want to make to a given database. If there were more options, they'd be listed here in the drop-down list box, or we can define a new connection. So what it's trying to accomplish on this step is to actually create what's called a connection string. Basically, a connection string just has all of the connection details that are required for an API like the Entity Framework to know where to go to connect to a database, what database it should connect to on that server, what the user's credentials are, and so on, things of that nature. So you can see here that it automatically generates a connection string. The only real question for us is how would we like that information saved in the web.config file. Now I think we've talked about the web.config before. Again, this is not an ASP.NET series per se, but the web.config is where we can put application settings that will be used by our app, and then it can be easily modified without having to recompile our code. So that web.config file is simply an XML file that will contain information. In this case, it'll be the connection to the database, the information. We'll see how that's manifested here in just a moment. So let's go ahead and click the next button there. Now we get to choose which objects that we want from the database. Now in our case, we only have one table called the customers table, but if we had multiple tables or views or stored procedures or functions, and let's not talk about that just yet, other objects from the database, we can select those as well. Here's some options about naming conventions, pluralization and singularization of the object names, foreign key columns. Again, these are notions that I don't want to delve into. Just go ahead and leave the defaults for now. We can choose a namespace for our model, and we know what namespaces are. It's just going to basically put it in a slightly different namespace than the rest of our project for the purpose of accessing the data. All right, and that's all we need, and we'll click the Finish button. And after a moment or two, you can see that we get a security warning. It'll say, are you sure you want to do this? Because running these sorts of scripts on your computer could potentially harm them. I don't know why it pops this up. I'm going to go ahead and click Do Not Show This Message again and click OK. Alrighty, so now what we have is an entity model, an entity data model, represented in a visual form on this designer surface. Now, if we had additional tables in our data model, we would see them rendered here in the rest of the white space. We might even see lines connecting them, indicating that there's some sort of relationship between those tables. We only have one table, it's represented here, no relationships to anything else, so what we see is kind of plain. But really, what happens here is not, or I should say what you see is not as important as what you see here in the Solution Explorer. All of the code that was generated from the selections we made in the wizard. Let's walk through a couple of these. You can see that, as I promised earlier, there's these .tt files, and these are generated as template files that will furthermore generate a series of classes. In this case, it'll create a context class. And a context, whenever you see that, it's simply a handle onto something. In this case, a handle onto the database, so that we can say, hey, database, I want something from you, give me this, and then all the code that's generated here in this class has the logic necessary to go out and connect to the database and perform the actions that we've requested. Okay. Obviously, this EDMX file also contains code used by the designer, mostly just looks like comments in this case, the diagram, settings, another template for creating the collection of customers. As you can see, it's empty, and then the customer object itself. And notice that it generated this class customer based on our database columns that we created. So we have a customer ID, name, address, city, state, postal code, and notes. And notice that our customer ID has already been set to type GUID. If we had chosen integers and other data types, we would see them represented here. So the Entity Framework understands the mappings between C# or .NET data types and SQL Server data types. Very cool. All right, so now that we've done that, let's go ahead and close it. We have a lot of the plumbing already in place, and all we need to do now is in our default.aspx, let's go ahead and add a label. Let's go ahead and paste a label here called result label, and then in the code behind, let's go in the page load, and let's start the process of actually connecting to a database. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is get that connection, that context to the database. And so this is where we named it Acme Entities. Acme Entities Context. Sometimes you'll see it just represented as DB or DB Context or just Con or just C or CXT. There's a lot of naming conventions out there. I think DB is probably the most common one because it does represent that connection to that database. That context gives us that connection to the database. So let's go new Acme Entities like so. All right, so now what we can do is say, give me a list of customers, and we'll just do db.customers like so. All right, so at this point, we've told the Entity Framework that we're interested in getting all of the customer records from the customer table in our database. It hasn't actually performed that step yet, though. Not until the very first time we attempt to use this customer's object will the query actually be executed and data return. So how will we go about doing this? Well, let's do string result equals, and then we'll do a for each tab var item in customers. Let's go ahead and change this to customer so it looks good. And here we'll go result plus equals, and we'll add a paragraph just in case we add more in the future, plus the customer dot name. Notice how we get strongly typed. We're working with objects that represent database tables instead of having to worry about the table names and all of that. All that's been generated for us based on the layout of the table that we created earlier. And let's go ahead and finish this up by closing out the paragraph tag in a literal string. And then finally we'll go result label dot text equals result. And if we've done everything correctly, then let's go ahead and run the application now, and we should see our lone customer from our database on our web page. Okay, very cool. I want to emphasize that there are many ways to do what we just did here. Again, one way for now to do this. We'll talk about other techniques and their pros and cons in another series. So now we've taken a huge step forward, but we've got some other cool things that we can do with it. Maybe we don't want to display the data like this. Maybe we want to display it in a more grid-like format. In fact, let's do that in the very next lesson. Let's go ahead and represent all the customers using a built-in control from ASP.NET called the grid control. We'll drag it from the toolbox onto our ASPX page and then configure a few things, and then we'll be able to see all of Bob's information in a grid. Let's do that next. See you in the next video. Thanks.